To understand my fear, you must first understand my past. As a child, I suffered a near-fatal accident. A drunken motorcyclist sent me careening off a road and into a fence, impaling my jaw on a wooden pole. Since that day, the very thought of anything or anyone near my mouth would paralyze me with fear. So, a dental clinic, to me, was the embodiment of all things terrifying. It was the news articles that got me concerned. A string of robberies in the town had been perpetrated by seemingly normal citizens. There was no connection between them. A few weeks ago, I cracked a molar. With each day, the pain grew unbearable. Faced with a choice between my dental phobia and this insufferable agony, I finally decided to visit Dr. Fallman's clinic. I remember walking into the pristine white room with sharp, gleaming instruments neatly laid out. The sterile smell of disinfectant failed to soothe my racing heart. Dr. Fallman was tall, strikingly so, with penetrating blue eyes. His presence was magnetic, his voice soothing and melodic. He was renowned not just for his skills, but also his ability to put his patients at ease. To my amazement, as he spoke to me, my terror subsided. "Relax," he whispered as he leaned close, his fingers delicately probing the contours of my jaw. "This won't hurt a bit." The procedure was a blur. I remember drifting into a deep trance, my fears melting away. His voice seemed to echo from afar, a hypnotic lullaby. When I left the clinic, I felt a strange emptiness, like a void had settled within me. Days went by, but something felt amiss. I began experiencing blackouts, waking up in places I didn't remember going to. One morning, I awoke with a duffel bag filled with cash and a pistol. Panic gripped me. My fingerprints were all over the weapon. Frantic, I hid the bag and gun, struggling to piece together the events of the previous night. Suspicion gnawed at my mind. What had Dr. Fallman done to me? I tried to recall the procedure. There were flashes of memories, whispers that felt just out of reach. I remembered his voice, the rhythm of his words, and an overpowering urge to do his bidding. The nightly news reported yet another gas station robbery. This time, the robber was caught on camera. It was me. The realization was shattering. Desperate, I decided to confront Dr. Fallman. I visited his clinic during business hours, hoping to catch him off guard. I walked into the waiting room, filled with oblivious patients. As I approached his office door, I'd overheard a conversation. The final stage of the process. Dr. Fallman's voice echoed. "Soon they will be under complete control. Our little army of obedient criminals, doing our bidding." Chills ran down my spine. I realized I wasn't alone. He was manipulating countless others, using them as pawns for his sinister games. Suddenly, someone grabbed me from behind, a cloth drenched in a pungent liquid pressed to my face. Darkness consumed me. I woke up strapped to a chair, the bright lights of the clinic blinding me. Dr. Fallman stood over me, his cold blue eyes piercing through mine. "Ah, you're awake," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I always suspected you might be trouble. What have you done to me?" I croaked, my throat dry. "It's simple," he said, leaning close. "I've unlocked the darkest corners of your mind, making you susceptible to my every command." He showed me a small device. "This emits a frequency that triggers your subconscious commands. Whenever you hear it, you obey." I struggled against the restraints, my mind racing. The weight of the crimes he forced me to commit bore down on me. I felt trapped, desperate. As he approached with a syringe, presumably to deepen my trance, I caped with all my might, knocking over a tray of instruments. The sharp tools clattered on the floor, scattering in all directions. Seizing the opportunity, I managed to grab a scalpel with my restrained hand. Dr. Fallman lunged at me, but I slashed the scalpel across his arm, making him drop the syringe. Using the momentary distraction, I freed myself and bolted for the exit. Police sirens wailed in the distance as I made my way out. I reported everything to them, but Dr. Fallman had vanished. The clinic was empty, no trace of the monstrous operations that had taken place there. It took months of therapy to piece my life back together. Dr. Fallman's hypnotic influence waned, but the fear lingered. For every night, just as sleep took me, I hear a distant whisper, a reminder of the darkness he had unlocked within. The worst part? Dr. Fallman was never caught. Every shadow, Every unfamiliar face, every whisper on the wind made me wonder if he was near, waiting for the moment to exert his control once again. And in the heart of my city, countless others, his unwilling minions, still roamed, carrying out unspeakable crimes at his behest. I've always been captivated by the whispered secrets of time-worn pages. As an antique book dealer, there's a thrill in hunting down these ancient relics, each possessing tales not just within their bindings but in their history. I'd held tomes that had outlived their owners and books that bore the stains of coffee, wine, and tears of generations past. But no book had ever haunted me like the Oblivio Tabula, the Book of Silence. The first time I heard of the Oblivio Tabula was from a fellow dealer named Richard. He called me late one night, his voice shaken. "It's here with me," he whispered. "That book. I can't seem to put it down." I laughed, assuming he had found a first edition of some classic literature. "What book? What's gotten into you?" "The Oblivio Tabula. Stay away from it." Then he hung up. Richard was found the next day in his home, sitting catatonically with the book on his lap. No doctor could explain his condition. He didn't react to any external stimuli, his gaze empty and lost. The story should have ended there, but a week later, another collector I knew, Sarah, called me. "I've got the Oblivio Tabula," she whispered in a manner disturbingly similar to Richard. The next day, she too was found in a catatonic state, the cursed book by her side. I began to investigate, needing answers. Everywhere this book appeared, its readers were left paralyzed, their minds seemingly trapped elsewhere. The book's provenance was vague. Originating perhaps in the 17th century, it had no author's name. Its content, to those brave enough to skim without investing, seemed innocuous, detailing various historical events without obvious connection. I decided I had to see it for myself. My curiosity, always my Achilles heel, pushed all caution aside. I tracked down the book's current holder, a frail old man named Mr. Caldwell. When I visited him, I found his large mansion filled with antiques and books, but the atmosphere was stifling, shadows clinging too tightly to the corners. Mr. Caldwell was seated in a grand armchair, the Oblivio Tabula on the table beside him. I could see it was bound in dark, almost black leather, and its title was embossed in deep gold. "I haven't opened it," he murmured, noticing my gaze. "Not since I saw what happened to my friends." "Why keep it then?" I asked, my gaze fixed on its enigmatic cover. "Because someone needs to ensure it doesn't harm anyone else," he replied. Determined to uncover its mystery without becoming its victim, I proposed studying the book under monitored conditions. In a research facility with doctors and cameras observing me, I would delve into its contents. The parameters were strict. I could study it for 10 minutes at a time, with breaks in between. The first session was uneventful. The book, written in Old Latin, detailed mundane events and places. But something felt off. The words seemed deeper than the page they were printed on, as if they had layers. In the second session, the unease grew. A cold draft circled my feet, and the room's bright lights dimmed and flickered intermittently. The text layers seemed to beckon me, luring me deeper. I could sense there was something hidden beneath the literal meanings, but my time was up. In the third session, I began to decipher the pattern. The events in the book weren't just historical. They were personal, intimately so. One entry spoke of a woman, her face obscured in darkness, waiting at the end of a bed, eerily reminiscent of a night terror I'd experienced as a child. I shared my findings with the overseeing doctor, Dr. Turner. "It's a psychological lure," I told him. "The book adapts to the reader's deepest fears, traumas, and memories. That's why its victims get trapped. They're ensnared in their own darkest recesses." Dr. Turner, a man of science and reason, looked skeptical. "You might be projecting, seeing patterns where none exist. Still, the personal connection is troubling." In the next session, I wore a heart monitor. I delved back in, trying to remain detached, but the book grew more insidious, weaving a tapestry of my life's most terrifying moments. An accident I'd seen as a teenager, the cold touch of a stranger in a crowded train, the choking fear of being lost in a foreign city. It was all there, depicted with unnerving accuracy. The heart monitor beeped rapidly. Dr. Turner instructed me to close the book, but the text had its claws in me. I couldn't. A dark abyss opened up, pulling me in. Visions blurred the line between reality and memories. Each seemed more terrifying than the last. I heard Dr. Turner's muffled shouts, but they were distant, lost in the whirlwind of horror the book conjured. Then suddenly, a hand forcefully shut the book, breaking the trance. Gasping, I looked up to see Mr. Caldwell, his eyes filled with understanding and fear. "You were about to be lost," he said, his voice trembling. "Another minute and you would have been like the others." I felt something was wrong. I had to come. I was shaken, but my mind was clear. The Oblivio Tabula was a mirror to one's darkest psyche, ensnaring the reader in a prison of their own horrors. There was no supernatural entity, no ghost or demon, just the relentless, inescapable terror of one's own memories and fears. "We have to destroy it," I whispered. But as we looked to the table where the book had been, it was gone. In its place was a simple note: some things are not meant to be understood. The Oblivio Tabula vanished that day, but the fear it instilled remains. Out there somewhere, the book waits for its next reader, ready to show them the depth of their own darkness. I can only hope it remains hidden, but deep down, the terror lingers, because the most horrifying monsters are the ones we carry within. I remember moving into the suburb, seeking solace from the concrete jungle's cacophony. I was a psychologist, constantly diving into the depths of the human psyche. The peace and quiet of this picturesque neighborhood seemed like the perfect antidote to my often noisy profession. The house I purchased was part of a series listed by the same real estate agent, Robert Goodwin. On the surface, Robert seemed like any other agent, always with a smile plastered on his face and an uncanny ability to sell houses like hotcakes. But there was something distant in his eyes, a history that he never shared, and an air of unease that lingered around him like a barely visible mist. It was the third night in my new abode, surrounded by white picket fences and perfectly manicured gardens, when the first nightmare struck. I found myself standing in the middle of a long, dimly lit corridor. The wallpaper, yellow with age and peeling at the edges, bore witness to time's decay. At the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, from which spilled a sickly orange glow. Whispers echoed from behind the door, incoherent and yet somehow familiar. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, more desperate. I felt an inexplicable dread. When I finally mustered the courage to peer inside, there was nothing. An empty room, save for the chilling presence of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was cast by no discernible object. Jolted awake, sweat dripping down my brow, I was relieved to find myself in the comfort of my room. The familiar surroundings provided some semblance of relief. However, at a neighborhood BBQ party a few days later, I discovered I wasn't the only one. As the night progressed and inhibitions decreased courtesy of wine and laughter, a neighbor hesitantly spoke about a recurring dream. The description was hauntingly similar to mine. The corridor, the whispers, the shadow. As the night wore on, more neighbors joined in, each recounting their own version of this shared nightmare. The atmosphere grew tense, conversations reduced to whispers, and faces pale. Curious, I began noting down patterns, asking specifics. To my astonishment, all these nightmares began shortly after moving into the houses sold by Robert Goodwin. I felt an itch, the same I'd often get at the start of a new case in my clinic. This was a puzzle I was determined to solve. Diving deep into the history of the neighborhood and the houses, I unearthed a peculiar finding. Decades ago, there had been another street where my house now stood. A fire had ravaged it, and the entire row of houses had been consumed. Families lost, memories charred. No one spoke of it anymore. Robert's family had been one of those who perished. It couldn't be a coincidence. I decided to confront Robert. His office, a little structure that looked out of place among the modern establishments, was a reflection of Robert himself. The inside smelled of aged wood and nostalgia. As I recounted our nightmares, his ever-present smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of genuine concern, or was it guilt? "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The truth," I replied firmly. With a sigh, he began. I didn't know about the fire. My grandparents died in it. My father barely made it out alive. The trauma left him scared, and he was haunted by nightmares. The same nightmares you described. He continued. He told me he'd hear the whispers of all those who were lost, see shadows in rooms, and the weight of their memories pressed on him every day. He became a real estate agent, hoping to rebuild the neighborhood, making it a happy place. And I continued his legacy. But these nightmares, I thought they were unique to him, a byproduct of the trauma. I never knew. It struck me then. The corridor in our nightmares resembled the hallways of old houses from that era. The door represented the barrier between life and memories lost, and the shadow. Perhaps it was the echo of lives lost, trying to communicate through the most vulnerable part of our psyche, our dreams. My logical mind struggled to wrap itself around the revelation. Was it the land's memories replaying themselves, or some form of collective unconscious shared amongst the residents? Determined to end this, I rallied the community. We held a memorial service for those who had perished, acknowledging their memories, the loss, and finally giving them a proper farewell. The nightmares diminished in intensity and frequency. A month later, they were a distant memory for most, but the echoes remained. One evening, as I sat in my garden, Robert approached, looking much older than I remembered. I'm retiring, he announced, and leaving the town. But why? I asked, surprised. I think it's time, he replied cryptically. By the way, he added, handing me a folded piece of paper. This was my father's. He wrote it during his last days. Opening the note, I found a series of sketches, corridors, doors, and a shadow. But it was the last sketch that made my heart drop. A sketch of a room with a man standing in the middle, casting a shadow. A shadow that looked eerily like Robert.